Thanks for watching this video from the Bible Fulfilled. My name's Alex Polyak. I am the director of the Bible Fulfilled. And today I'm going to be talking about Deuteronomy 32 verse 35. This is a prophecy about Israel's last days. Moses gave this prophecy about 1500 years before the time of Christ. And opponents of preterism often bring up this passage when trying to explain, or explain away is probably a better term. Anyway, they often bring this passage up when trying to explain the New Testament's timing indicators. Deuteronomy 32 verse 35 talks about Israel's calamity being at hand, yet the event did not take place for 1500 years. So if this at hand can mean, 1500 years in the Old Testament, then it can mean the same in the New Testament. So when the Apostle James, for example, said in approximately the year AD 60 that, quote, the coming of the Lord is at hand, and you can read this in James 5 verse 8, or when the Apostle Paul said in Philippians 4 verse 5 that the Lord is at hand, or when the Apostle Peter said in approximately AD 63 that the end of all things is at hand, and you can read that in 1 Peter 4 verse 7. So opponents of preterism say that we don't have to interpret these statements to mean that these events were about to happen, because as in the Old Testament, at hand can mean thousands of years. At least that's what their view is. But is this argument sound? Are the opponents of preterism right about this Deuteronomy passage? Or is there something more going on here? I think it's the latter. And that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. Okay, so let me start by reading the passage. Again, this is Deuteronomy 32 verse 35. This was written by Moses approximately in 1500 BC. Or that's at least when Moses uttered the passage. And it's actually God talking in this prophecy. And God says, quote, vengeance is mine and recompense. Their foot shall slip in due time, for the day of their calamity is at hand. So again, this is Deuteronomy 32 verse 35. So this passage is referring to Israel's calamity, and God is saying that their foot shall slip in due time, for the day of their calamity is at hand. So again, opponents of preterism say that this at hand statement, wasn't fulfilled for 1500 years. So if at hand doesn't have to mean about to happen in the Old Testament, then at hand doesn't have to mean about to happen in the New Testament, particularly in those verses that talk about the second coming. Okay, so what do we make of this? First off, imagine an atheist was trying to convince you that the Bible teaches that there is no God based on Psalms 14 verse 1, which does in fact say there is no God. And that's right, you heard correct. Psalms 14:1 really does say the words, there is no God. Those exact words. Now, if you were familiar with the context, you would quickly point out that the previous part of the verse says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. So the context completely turns around the meaning, right? The same thing happens when we look at the context of Deuteronomy 32 verse 35. This passage is part of a larger discussion, or it's a prophecy actually, that began in the previous chapter. Moses was warning Israel that in Israel's last day, Israel would turn away from the Lord. And here's what Moses said back in Deuteronomy 31 verse 29. Quote, for I know that after my death, you will become utterly corrupt. And he's talking about Israel here. You will become utterly corrupt and turn aside from the way which I commanded you, and evil or calamity would befall you in the latter days. End quote. This is Deuteronomy 31 verse 29. So Moses is prophesying that in Israel's last days, she would become utterly corrupt, and evil or calamity would befall her. Actually, 3 times in this context of this Deuteronomy chapter 31 and 32, 3 times in this context, Moses says that this would happen in Israel's last days. You can read this in Deuteronomy 31 verse 29. You can read it in Deuteronomy 32 verse 20. And you can read it in Deuteronomy 32 verse 28. So in Israel's last days, she would become utterly corrupt, after which calamity or judgment would befall her, as it says in the passage I just read in Deuteronomy 31 verse 29. So this is the calamity that's still being talked about in the verse that I'm discussing, Deuteronomy 32 verse 35. Again, here's what the passage says. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord, and recompense. Their foot shall slip in due time, for the day of their calamity is at hand.
Potential of your crew, combining offense, defense, and morale for ultimate domination. Redeem.
So what Moses was essentially prophesying in this passage, in poetic fashion, is that calamity or judgment would befall Israel in her last days. So this would not happen right away. It would happen in Israel's last days. In fact, notice the phrase "in due time." So it says that vengeance is mine and recompense, their foot shall slip in due time. So this would not happen right away. It would happen in due time. In other words, it would happen in Israel's last days. This is when her foot would slip, or this is when she would become utterly corrupt, and then this is when her calamity or her judgment would be at hand. So that is what Moses was saying. He was saying that when Israel became utterly corrupt, which would happen in her last days, then her calamity or her judgment would be at hand. This is a poetically stated when-then prophecy. A when-then prophecy basically means when X happens, then Y would happen. And in this case, when Israel's foot slipped or when she became utterly corrupt, then her calamity or her judgment would be at hand. So Moses was not saying that calamity or judgment was at hand when this passage was written. He was simply saying that he was simply saying that when Israel's foot slipped, when she became utterly corrupt, then her calamity or her downfall would be at hand. Jesus made a similar kind of a when-then prophecy in the Olivet Discourse. In Luke 21, verse 20, Jesus said, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, and he's talking to his disciples here, he says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that her desolation is near. This is Luke 21 verse 20. So this is another one of those when-then prophecies. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that her destruction will be near. This is the same kind of thing that Moses is saying in a poetic fashion in Deuteronomy 32. When Israel's foot slipped, when she became utterly corrupt, then her calamity or her downfall would be at hand. So I think this is what the passage is referring to. So the context of the Deuteronomy passage clearly shows that Moses he was not saying that this prophecy was at hand at the time of writing. He was just, making a when-then kind of a